Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Saturday, 14 March 2015 episode of When Did You Wake Up with Erin Pizzey. I am, as usual, Erin's co-host, Dean Esme. You with me this glorious day, Erin?
Yes, and it's a lovely, lovely sunset evening in London, and I have my trusty cup of tea next to me, and I can't wait to start talking to our guest.
Excellent. Well, before we do that, I'd like to do what we customarily do, which is a brief update on what's going on with whiteribbon.org, your website dedicated to the subject of domestic violence. This week, actually, since we last spoke, we've had two articles go up on the site. We have In Defense of the Family by some woman named Erin Pizzey. Do you know her?
Vaguely. I try to pretend I don't.
And we put that article. That article was put up for you on whiteribbon.org. Actually, to be honest, I'm embarrassed. I didn't read it. What's it about?
Basically, Dr. Ruth Weiss, unfortunately she's died, but she was a brilliant professor at Harvard, and essentially she warned all that time ago the danger of this movement and what it would do to relationships between men and women. And I then wrote the introduction to what she was saying, and the rest of the article is what I have said is the situation at the moment, and it's perilous. So it's something that's very, very close to my heart.
Yeah, I see you mentioning in the article that you had attempted to reach out to America's National Organization for Women back years ago, which is the largest feminist organization in America, and all now groups were warned against even
They weren't
speaking to
allowed,
you.
exactly. I was doing a tour of America, actually, and I'd come down to San Francisco, and I'd had originally a lot of interest in the now groups there. And I flew in to find that they had all been issued with barring notice that they were not to come anywhere near me. But fortunately, a few very brave women snuck into my hotel and began to tell me all about it. And of course, that was years ago. That was something like 25 years ago that happened. And it isn't any different now. I'm barred from every domestic violence conference run by feminists. I'm not even allowed up the steps of my own refuge. And but it's changing. Dean, you of all people can see how far we've come since we've known each other.
It's very true that it has changed. It certainly hasn't changed enough, but I think what we've found is that by creating our own media outlets, and A Voice for Men is probably the biggest, but there are others, just refusing to be silent and going ahead and embracing the hate from the establishment and speaking our truth anyway, and speaking about the science anyway. More and more people are noticing it, and I'm seeing it. I really am seeing it in the media. I mean, it's still quite bad, but even there, the feminist ideologues, the worst of them, seem to be getting more and more shrill and more desperate.
I think that'll
I also saw you
continue.
see an interesting note. Hmm?
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, what? I also saw in this article you mentioned that your book, Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear, which was the first book on the problem of family violence, was plagiarized by a feminist writer.
Yes,
Uh,
Del Martin. She
really?
was a very famous radical lesbian, and I'd refused to allow my book to be published in America because the publishers were going to rewrite it anyway and give it a feminist slant, and I said no, thank you. So she took my book and she holed herself up and wrote a book called Battered Women, with, I must say, a load of, thanks to Erin's Pizzey Scream Quietly, but essentially plagiarized the whole book. And
What was her name again? What was her name again?
her name was, I just said it, oh
Dale
dear,
Martin?
yeah, Del Martin, that's it, Del,
Dale.
Delmartin.
Oh, I see. Dale Martin.
And she
Okay.
was out of
Uh,
California.
interesting. Interesting. Well, everybody should go to whiteribbon.org to check that out, along with the enormous amount of research and interviews and data showing domestic violence is not a gendered issue and never really has been. We also have a fascinating article up on whiteribbon.org called Lynched by the Feminist Mob-ettes, written by an Australian gentleman, Dr. Tanveer Ahmed, about his experience with the Australian White Ribbon campaign and how they condemned him. And what's interesting to me about that article is if you look at what he actually wrote, it's not even all that challenging to the feminist narrative, and that he still mostly concentrates on men's violence towards women, which is still only half the problem. But even that was enough to nearly get him lynched just because he was critical and said the entire domestic violence industry is stuck in a 1970s ideological feminist mode. And
but that's enough. You know that's enough to get you drummed out of the brownies, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is, as he has discovered. But
anyway, he's on board now, and it's up on White Ribbon, so everyone can read it. It's a really good, clear article.
Yes, it really is. And so everybody make sure to check out In Defense of the Family by Erin Pizzey, Lynched by the Feminist Mob-ette by Dr. Tanveer Ahmed, and keep watching that space. whiteribbon.org continues, and do not take donations. We are there to educate the public about the truth regarding domestic violence, and there's an enormous amount of data on there you really should see. So, all right, with that all said, this week our guest is Jasmin Newman. This is a fascinating lady from down under. She runs a website called Relating to Men. She does what she calls sex and relationships coaching. I know that I've been actually watching this lady for at least 6 months, if not closer to a year, and watching her somewhat change her views on a lot of issues, start questioning things. She's recently come out and declared that she is, in fact, a men's rights advocate. And from what I know, her practice now is devoted pretty much exclusively to men. Jasmin, are you with us?
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning, Jasmin. So glad you should meet us. So you run Relating to Men. You do sex and relationships coaching for men. I understand you have clients all over the world. So I know you are a former feminist, more or less, and I'm curious, and I'll start by asking you the question we always ask. When did you wake up, and what caused you to do so?
Okay. Well, I'm not a former feminist. I've never really identified with feminism. I think I was one of those people that kind of sat quite neutrally on feminism. I still remember vividly being told I was a feminist by something that I said when I was in my late teens, and I was horrified because I grew up in a fairly anti-feminist household, and I've always had very strong views, and I've always been very outspoken, and so in that way, I recognised, or what I attributed to me being able to have a voice was probably from feminism, but that's about my only link to it whatsoever. So,
well, you did write for a time for the Good Men Project, which I know is definitely a feminist organization. Although oddly enough, they try to deny it. It's odd. Why would they?
One doesn't know these things when one naively goes into an agreement like that. I didn't know that when I started writing for them, and in fact, over the last year or so, and particularly over the last few months, even when I stopped writing for them, my knowledge and comprehension of just how endemic feminism is and the problems that it's causing, certainly came to highlight in my time for writing for Good Men Project. There's no doubt about it.
I wanted to say to you, it was probably about 1974, so we're talking about 30-something years ago. I was asked to speak both in New Zealand and also in Australia. And it was Elsie, one of the first Australian refuges, well, they're called shelters, aren't they, that I was supposed to be speaking at, and then continuing a tour of Australia. Anyway, I got to New Zealand, and as soon as I began to talk about generational family violence and kids being marinated in violence and the effects, suddenly I was no longer invited to Australia. So I was banned from coming across to Australia to coming to any of your shelters or refuges. So I've always had that in my mind, because I do think, apart from Canada, that I think is an absolutely terrifying, almost virtually feminized total country, I think Australia has an appalling history of attitude towards Australian men. Do you think I'm right?
Well, I guess this is where my eyes have only really been opened up just in recent times. I haven't been involved in men's rights or in issues of family violence professionally. I've certainly been aware of it, but even as a teenager, I was aware that men were getting the raw end of the deal, and that's something that I've said for most of my life, is that I was glad I was born a female, because I wouldn't want the life that a man had to have, and I felt that they were missing out on a lot, and I certainly always identified more with men. But in relation to things like shelters and domestic violence or family violence, I was probably quite ignorant to it for most of my life, but I certainly see it now, and yeah, I completely agree that we do treat them appallingly.
I was going to tell you that actually I'm very lucky to be talking to you today, because I had an email this morning from my website, the whiteribbon.org, and it's from a guy who is in his 30s, and he said something that really touched me. He said, I grew up in a home where feminism was considered that all men were pigs and idiots, and it so scarred him, he says, that even now at the age of 30 he has refrained from having any relationships with women, as much as he would love to. He'd love to have a partner, but the few women he's come across have actually virtually told him that by virtue of being a man, the whole male privilege stuff. Anyway, I was thinking to myself, there's an awful lot now of a generation of men who had radical feminist mothers who, I don't know if you've come across this, but who have actually brought themselves sons up to feel ashamed of themselves.
I think, I think generationally that, I've just turned 50, and I see a fair bit of that in men around my age, because we as little children, it was very much in the uprising of feminism, and I know that it's something that my mother used to talk about quite a lot. And I see, like a lot of things, I think we hang on to a lot of the ideologies from our childhood, and I do see that in men. I'm just sort of thinking globally, dotted around the world at various different times. But being shamed, we're often shamed by our parents, and I hope that I haven't done it to my children, but I think none of us are perfect parents. But when we have strong points of view that that children are naturally raised into believing, and it takes an awful lot to move away from that and to put that down and to move into a place where you accept yourself for the person that you are and for what you believe in.
Yeah, because it's almost impossible for a man to grow any sense of self. The mother who bore him considers himself somehow damaged because he's a male.
But see, that I find absolutely abhorrent, and still, there's things that come across before me where you kind of think you're pretty resilient to most things that you hear, but then occasionally you hear something and your gut just sinks, and you're just like, it makes no sense. I can't imagine doing that to another human being, but it certainly does happen, yes.
Well, I suppose if you are born and bred into thinking of men as dangerous and violent because they're men, and then, I mean, like I used to get picketed, and the banners used to say, all men are racist, all men are butterers, all men are bastards. And I remember going out actually to the police who were holding this huge crowd of women back and saying, if that was black men or Jews, you'd arrest those women because it's only men, you don't bother.
Yeah,
you know,
very
and
true.
that really, I mean, I just remember looking at this situation and thinking to myself, and this was again many years ago, and you think, now here we are in the 21st century, and it's too slow. It's not moving fast enough.
I think, you know, a lot of the times I'm constantly under scrutiny, which I actually love because it really helps me to grow. But you know, a lot of the times I'm asked, you know, what got me into men's rights, which is why I did my little video the other day. But you know, one of my primary things is for the sake of our children. You know, I have a son, and I do fear for the way our sons particularly are being raised into this world full of male hatred, and for the services that need to be available to them, you know, issues within my own family where I've seen my own family have to go without services, you know, men in my own family. And I think that, you know, it's not going to stop here. You know, we've got a long way to go before we can see that this is right. You know, I want there to be, I want my son particularly to grow into a world where it's equal, but my daughter as well, who's, you know, she's a teenager now, and, you know, she's well aware of the issues of feminism, and in fact she's become quite the vocal little thing at school, and you know, standing up for men's rights, which is fantastic. I'm very proud of her. Yeah, so...
Well, my feeling is that one of the difficulties looking at... Now, see, I have sons, I have grandsons, and I have great-grandsons. My son was raised in the 70s, and even though the barricades were up by then, it wasn't as pervasive as it is now. It hadn't by that time infected education to the degree it did later for my grandson. So the boys are going into school where they're rabidly discriminated against, because as boys they're not considered to be able to do well. Girls are constantly being, so I don't know about Australia, but every year when the results come through, the school examination results come through, the photographs of girls jumping up and down, and all the numbers of girls who have done so enormously well, no pictures of boys. Just long articles about how boys are failing in school. They then move from school, and if they're lucky, they get that. So they have a hostile environment at school. They move on to university, and there again they hit the same thing. It's a totally hostile place for young men. I don't know how you feel about letting your son, if he does go to university. The fact is that he will have to be so incredibly careful of any relationship he has with any girl at the university, because he's so open to having it abused.
And you know, therein lies probably my biggest fear. Both of my children are very pragmatic and pretty resilient, but that doesn't protect them. And when they do need protecting, you know, we need to know, you know, if something happens, if there are any accusations, then we need to know that they're safe. A man who's been a long-time client of mine actually messaged me last night concerned about, he's in the UK, and about his sons at school and how he feels that you know, boys' needs are being, you know, are lesser to the girls' needs at school in terms of the education, and that the education is all skewed towards a female way of learning to try and you know, bring these girls up and you know, give them all their equality and privilege and everything else that they want, and that it's damaging to the boys in terms of their self-esteem. So, you know, it leads back to the same argument what's happening to our young men. He has 2 sons, and and he fears for them. He watches them feeling less, their self-esteem going down where it should be rising up.
Because we've even, in our state school, we've even got rid of the things that boys used to do. They've got rid of the playing fields. So the school day isn't interrupted by allowing boys and girls to go out and let off steam. So you've got these incredibly active young boys, say in primary school where I was teaching or helping them to read, and looking at them, exactly as you said, these little round tables where they all sit round, the girls interspersed with the boys, and it's mostly, or the work isn't exam, it's actually long-term kind of projects, which is not what boys are good at, and the girls are very, very good at. And so what happens in the end is it's self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
Oh, look, yeah. I mean, one of my other jobs is as a children's fitness educator, and that drives me insane to think that these boys particularly aren't allowed to go and run around and blow off steam. They absolutely need to, and I mean, all children should be more active. But I heard a story just recently from a local school here where the boys were playing handball, and they one of the girls who identifies as a feminist in middle high school had, she wanted to play, and they said no, and she ran off crying foul and feminism and misogyny because she wasn't allowed to play handball with these boys. And I said, it's not that we don't like women, we just want to play handball. We just want to hang out with the guys, and it should be okay for the guys to hang out with the guys.
Well, I'm afraid these days it isn't, unless the woman actually. It's one of the funniest things is I can't think of anything more privileged than white Western women, having been born in China and grew up in the Middle East, coming here when I was much older, and looking at the situation globally. And I travel a lot as well. And here we have these privileged white middle-class women denying men any role in society and claiming that they are the ones who have the privileges. I always thought it was a luxury to be a woman and to have the choice to stay home and bring up my children if I wanted to.
Yes, yeah.
And I was then, of course now, the situation is so dire for women that not only are you forced out to work, so the government can claim 2 sets of taxes, but our Cameron, Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, announced that women who stay at home to bring up their children will not get a sum of cash that he's giving to women who go out to work, because staying at home with children is a lifestyle choice. Just a lifestyle choice. It's not the hardest, most difficult job anybody, man or woman, is going to ever do in their lives. See, I think that's appalling. Appalling.
Yes, yeah, I do too. I'm not sure what the government's doing here now. I'm a little bit out of that loop, but I know when I got married and had my children when they were very young, and I sort of thought, oh, this is all right, I'll get to stay home. But of course, as you say, parenting isn't the easiest thing, and it wasn't something, because of my own childhood, it wasn't something that came very easily to me. And I couldn't wait to get back to work, but I was in a situation where it was easy for me to be to have flexible hours as well. I've always worked for myself, so.
But that still, I mean, at least you had choice. You see, what
choice? Yeah.
Happened with all this, with women were screaming for choice to go and be wage slaves, is that's exactly what they are, and they're also house slaves as they were originally. So really, this is a movement that's backfired more onto women than it ever has on men in a strange way. Because as you get movements like, do you know MGTOW, men going their own way?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and now more and more men are doing just that. And what happens then to the women who are left behind? I know, particularly, I live between London and LA, because my son's in LA with the family. And I'm there a lot, and I see these wonderful, vibrant, beautiful women in their 40s coming up for 50s who've frantically missed the boat. They're not going to have children, it's too late. Men aren't actually going to men certainly in LA, men understand hookup and not much else. And the women complain bitterly about the men not making any kind of commitment. But what man in his right mind these days would take the risk?
Yeah, there's
One of the
certainly...
things that I found, if I can interrupt,
Yeah, sure.
I apologize. One of the things I found, and if I can interrupt, is I know a number of men who call themselves men going their own way. Now, one thing I find unfortunate is some of them are rather angry, but some of them are actually sad. From my perspective, if you want to be a bachelor your whole life, why, that's a perfectly honorable choice. There's not a bloody thing wrong with it, not at all. But the sad part to me is the men who say, I would really like to settle down. I would really like to find a nice girl, but I look at what's out there and I can't justify doing it. So I'll just enjoy my life as it is as a single person. I wish it were different, but no, it can't be.
Yeah.
And we've created a social system where there's a real punishment for many men. I mean, there's no doubt some men pair up and wind up in terrific relationship and everything's fine, but the fact of the matter is that if it goes south, who's got all the power to destroy the other person?
It is a very fearful situation, and one of my dreams is that women can start to turn up as women again in the relationships and just let men be men. And that was, initially that was one of my core messages. I didn't realise how much hatred that was going to get spewed upon me from women, because women want to be whatever they want to be, and that's fine. But they don't turn up in the relationship as equal in any way, shape, or form. Or they don't allow men to do that. I think that for men who are still in the age bracket, excuse me, where they will be likely to be parents, I think that's a particular concern. Excuse me. That's a particular concern, and I can see why they're choosing to opt out of relationships altogether. Like you though, Dean, I've spoken to quite a few men in MGTOW, and their choices are their own if they're going to stay away from relationships altogether. I can understand why, but like you say, I also see men in that movement who are quite sad and are quite hopeful, but there's very few women out there that they meet that they feel that they can trust with the level of integrity that they need.
Yeah, I think that's very true, actually. I think one of the difficulties with all this is there is such a huge hostile divide, because actually underneath all this there has been this really a gender war, and most people, certainly my age group, and I'm in my 70s, have very little knowledge of what's going on, which is possibly true right the way across society. So it isn't part of your work or understanding or day-to-day life. You trundle merrily along until, like one day, a couple of weeks ago, a man in his 50s was going home, and he was on the platform, and he caught the train, and he went home. And the next morning, at 6:30, there was a knock on his door. 4 policemen walked in. They showed him a picture, a CCTV picture of him. Said, "Is this you?" And he said, "Well, yes, it could be me, yes." And the time was 4 something, and he was there at that time. And they arrested him on the grounds that a woman had claimed that she had been sexually assaulted at around the same time that he was there. There had been hundreds and hundreds of other people on that station, and they had decided to charge him and take him down to the station and let him out on bail. This is an ordinary, normal man who has no history of anything behind him, is well loved and respected, and overnight he's suddenly a possible sex pervert. Now, that is shattering for him, particularly because he's never been involved in the gender war. And when you talk about when did you open your eyes, he is still traumatically shocked by what happened. And it'll take probably a year before the Crown Prosecution Service decides to prosecute him or not, because what's happened in England, the police, because of the hysteria over rape, The police can no longer drop a case. Every case, however stupid, has to go to the Crown Prosecution Service. So the result is there are innocent people all over this country, men, who have this hanging over them.
And it sticks. You know, it sticks within their within their local circles, and sometimes as far as they'll lose their jobs. It's not the sort of thing that people forget. Those accusations, before proven, is something that people hang on to, and part of the reason is the hysteria that we have around, the manufactured hysteria around rape and rape culture, which in Australia is certainly becoming, it's something that's in the media almost daily at the moment. Is the the culture of family violence is so prevalent, and the culture of rape is so prevalent that accusations around this sort of thing. Right. Yeah, people want to jump on board and say, oh yeah, he's a wife basher, or he's a rapist, or and there's not necessarily any foundation to it whatsoever, and quite often not. There's an extraordinary amount of innocent men have shared their stories with me, and I sit back patiently and listen to their stories, because sometimes all they need is just to be heard and to know that they're not being judged. I think the impact that these accusations have on these men is absolutely crushing. They lose, neighbours and friends. They lose credibility in their social circles and in their business circles, and it's incredibly damaging. And I fear for them.
What bothers me most is like so often, when they come across White Ribbon or they see A Voice for Men, suddenly they realise that they're not alone, and that is life-saving for many of the men. Because being alone and believing that this is only happening to you is the most terrifying place to be. And when I say, if you looked at the suicide figures for men across the Western world, and nobody actually can be bothered to do anything about it, but an awful lot of those suicides are men who are wrongly accused, who've lost their families, they've lost their children, and they're mostly homeless, and they have been either jailed or punished or had their passports removed and their driving license removed, and this is happening now. And unfortunately, yeah, go on. Sorry,
I was just going to make the point, about sharing stories. I'm quite a big fan of the work of Brené Brown, who is a shame and vulnerability researcher, and one of her quotes, which I love, which is that shame can't survive being spoken about, and it can't survive empathy. And I've found that to be so true. And these men reaching out, particularly for the first time, and having somebody who will just listen to their story. And then to be able to network with other men who have experienced the same, and they're all going, yeah, me too. And it's so incredibly valuable to be able to provide whatever services we can. I mean, we have no funded services for this, but for men to be able to reach out and to start to speak, I think is first part of the healing process, to know that they're not being judged and that they're not alone.
I think the thing that most bothers me is the other men. I mean, White Ribbon Australia, to me, which is UK and all the rest of them. They're such turncoats, essentially saying that, all other men except me, because I've got this white ribbon. We don't do anything awful to women because I just think that one of the problems for this men's movement has actually been the level where other men will not stand up and protect. And when you ask... Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Dean.
I can speak a little to that.
Okay.
So I've run into the same thing. I've been watching this stuff for 20 years now, on and off, maybe a little more than that, but since the 80s, really. And personally, what got me most interested was the domestic violence issue. But of course, once you get into the domestic violence issue, it's sort of like Alice down the rabbit hole. The more you look, the more you see, and the more you see, the more you look, or want to run away, one of the two. But there have been psychological studies, a couple of that have shown that, and this is an interesting experiment. It's worth pondering. They've shown that if you put people in a neutral setting, like just an office and a table, and show them random photographs of people. Do you like this person? Do you want to help this person? This person's in trouble. Do you want to help them? This person is sad. Do you want to help them? When shown pictures of women, women show, strange women they don't know, mind you. Women tend to immediately sympathize with the woman or want to help the woman. And when shown pictures of a strange man they don't know, they're more likely to be hostile to him. And men have the exact same response, which is that if they see a woman they don't know, a picture of her, and say she's sad or she's hurt or she's in trouble and she needs help, he's immediately sympathetic to her. And if they're shown a picture of a man and told the same story, he's more cautious and he's more skeptical of the man and his story, which they call an in-group bias. Men have an in-group bias toward women, and women have an in-group bias toward women. In other words,
so where's the missing link then? Why is it that men don't have a bias towards helping each other? Is it, do you think, primitive?
My theory, and either one of you can challenge me on this, is that it's partly primitive. Like, as a species, we probably wouldn't have survived if men didn't have something of a protective instinct toward women.
Yeah.
Or we'd be very different as a species if men didn't have this sort of protective instinct toward women. But I think society and culture at large plays an enormous part too, because I'm pretty sure I could make a good case that racism has a biological primitive function too.
Yeah.
Those people don't look like us. They're strange. They're weird. They smell funny. Yes. They look funny. They talk funny. We don't trust them. And there's a fix for that now, isn't there?
Yeah.
Education, and getting to know people, and just being aware. Wait a minute, that's not a rational response. And so I do think culture plays a part in it. And I think there has actually been, Warren Farrell called it the lace curtain, where ideological feminists who believe women are oppressed across the board by this mythical patriarchy take the reins of power in the media. Men are afraid to challenge them, and the message that there's a problem here doesn't get through. We still see it constantly on A Voice for Men, and for that matter with your own whiteribbon.org, the mainstream press just routinely savages and attacks and mocks us. There was a horrifically dishonest piece in GQ recently, for example, and they just savaged us. But what we find, I know I'm getting on my pedestal here, is if we just go ahead and embrace the hate and say we don't care if you hate us, we're not shutting up, something does start to change, at least somewhat. And I'm particularly pleased when I hear women with daughters. Now, Jasmin, you're at least the third woman I've heard recently who's told me she's got a daughter in school who is challenging the anti-male narrative. That tells me that there's something in young women that can see a problem. And maybe women do have a protective instinct toward their menfolk too that just needs to be activated somehow. I don't know. What do you ladies think?
Well, you go ahead, Jasmin. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think you're well on the money with both of the theories there in terms of biology, particularly. I think, just relating back to the study that you mentioned, I think that, if we were to take that right back to primal instincts, I would say that it would be fairly normal. And, I completely understand it. As for you know, the young women today, I find, you know, my own daughter was in a situation at school where one of her teachers was saying that the girls had to align, you know, the men had to align with feminism, and she sort of stood up and blurted out everything I think she'd ever heard me say about you know, men's rights and you know, a man's needs are equal to a woman's, and that women don't get to have the upper hand necessarily. And from conversations that I've had with her and with other teenagers in quite a few numbers of schools, is my feeling, and I'm very pleased to say this, is that there are probably more girls growing up aware of the ills of feminism. You know, they're seeing things like the free bleeding and the, you know, the radical feminist stuff that comes out. I can barely even get to think about that, you know, process that one. I know. But they're seeing that side of feminism through social media, and so, you know, they're shooting themselves in the foot, and these girls are saying, well, we don't want to align with that, so if we don't align with that, then we must align with the guys. So, you know, perhaps it's a cyclical thing that in this next generation might come up. But I know that that in my daughter's school, and, you know, as I said, she's in middle high school, that she can kind of point out the couple of girls that identify with feminism and do so quite radically, and everybody else would be quite neutral or more to the side of the guys.
One of the difficulties I see is actually the universities, the Western universities, because they have really been infiltrated for 50 years now. So you get perfectly ordinary girls going into university. And I actually agree with you at one level, because I'm getting a lot more young students emailing me to say, I'm doing men's studies and I'd like to ask you to help me. But I also get women saying, my problem is, if I actually say what I really want to say, I won't get my degree.
Yes.
And that's not only from universities, that's also from young social workers. Because if you look at the textbooks in England that are actually this is how the social workers get their degree, they have to virtually see everything through feminist lens.
Yes, and changing that systemically is part of one of my passions, and you know, I think I said this in my recent video as well. You know, it's a political system, it's a legal system, and it's a social system that says that the only thing that matters is women. The only thing that matters is feminism, and that's what we need to change. I don't know what's going to happen to this generation of girls now as they, you know, in the next 5 years when they head to university, and how much of that will be swayed, you know, in terms of studies that they take. I mean, the whole gender studies thing drives me insane. You know, if you're going to study gender, study gender. You know, when we look at men only as perpetrators and not as possible victims, then we're, you know, denying half of the problem, half of what's going on. They keep saying that they want to understand it, particularly in Australia at the moment. It's very topical with family violence, and you know, they want to change men's behaviour, but they're doing nothing to understand men, because they're ignoring the fact that they can be victims of women.
But they're not this is the difficulty. It's not seeing it as family violence. It's only paying lip service to family violence. Essentially, it's the argument, which is how the feminists got into these positions of power, being that all men are guilty of being part of the patriarchy. They are born actually doomed to rape and to kill and to abuse everybody, and particularly women. And that's the statement that is underneath everything a feminist stands for. That's why when 40-something years ago, it arrived in England, most of us were sold a bill of goods. We were all told, oh, this is about equality between men and women. And everybody agreed. It's only once they unpacked the Trojan horse and all the rest of it came out that the majority of women in this country, of my age group, left. But by leaving, they left a huge power gap, which was then filled with Marxist radical feminists, actually nothing to do with women, mostly that the women in universities were fighting for tenure. So by creating women's studies, which ring-fenced men out of it, they could get their tenures as professors of women's studies. So it was a trajectory towards huge amount of power, and now it's happened in the Western world. Majority of power in universities is held in radical feminists' hands, and that is extremely dangerous.
Yeah, I would have to agree.
I actually do find myself wondering, and I've had a conversation with some professors about this. I mean, I guess I'm just blathering, but women are a majority of university students now,
Yeah.
and it's a growing majority with no sign of that slowing down. We're right around the 60% mark now. It's probably going to go to 65% within a few years, maybe but more. What happens when men just decide, I'm not doing it, I'm not going? And then these girls hit university and there are no men there, or very few men, and there's huge competition for the men who are there. Like, I'm not sure society will sustain as many universities as it has if men are just dropping out and refusing to participate in university anymore.
I'll tell you something that I saw, which has nothing to do with feminism actually, but is germane to what we're discussing. I was asked to go to the men's groups in Bermuda, and their particular problem arose because after the war there were the great big American and Canadian bases in Bermuda, and there was a huge amount of work. So fathers took their sons and they became tradespeople and they brought in very, very good sums of money. But then the mothers and the fathers decided that the university degrees, they would send their daughters, mostly abroad, to go to universities and then come back. So by the time I was there, so this would have been in the 90s, early 90s, by the time I got there, it was an extraordinary sight. Rush hour was full of women in flash cars driving rush hour, because they were the bankers, they were the elite workers in Bermuda. You go to a restaurant, women having dinner with women. Now the men's problem was they were all very well qualified workers, blue-collar workers, and the women had no choice unless they could find themselves, somebody from abroad to marry, but to marry with labouring men. That never lasted very long. As soon as they had the children, they dumped the men. The men had to then pay child support. An awful lot of them were jailed, and they were allowed out during the day to pay child support and then locked up at night again. Now, it was extraordinary to see what happened. There were the women moaning and crying because there were no available men with equal parity with them. And this is a situation that nobody created. But that's what it's going to look like, isn't it?
And that gets to a thorny issue in female nature that a lot of people don't like to talk about. I think this is rooted in biology too. Oh hell, let somebody get mad at me. The vast majority of women prefer a man who is better educated and more well off than she is.
Yeah, that's always been the case.
And when they can't find them, they get very frustrated. And they're likely to dump the man they feel is their social inferior and all that. And it's because they're not recognizing, oh, well, I've been empowered, but I want a man who's at least as powerful, is not more powerful than me. And there aren't any to be had. You see what I'm saying?
I do. I see absolutely what you're saying. And I
It's a
think
self-defeating cycle.
Yeah, it is. And that's the thing that I think. This whole idea of women have always been socially mobile. We're very, very good at marrying up. And men have been all very comfortable with women who essentially don't have to be hugely able intellectually, but to be good wives, mothers, lovers, and a good, warm, loving person. But for us women, it's deeply biological that you want a man who will actually fund and take care of you while you're extremely vulnerable in those early childbearing years, and is prepared to go the distance so that your children can move up and go to universities and achieve. I don't see why anybody should mind that.
No, I don't either. I sit very much in the same camp, Erin. I think that as long as, one of my core messages is that we all need to be true to ourselves and essentially true to our biological makeup. Yeah, and that's where we've completely lost perspective. And I think that women do love to nurture. Certainly in the earlier years, especially when they've got small children, but and they, as a result of that nurturing, then they're the ones that are looking for protection. But it's where it goes wrong in the years after that I don't understand. I don't understand this sort of dump and run attitude. I mean, I'm a separated woman too. I'm had a marriage that was a success for 15 years, but is no more. And we amicably chose to go our own way and to move on with our lives. We have a great relationship, still now even in separation. But the early years when women are at home and having children, they need that protection. What they're looking for after that is something that I don't understand. I don't understand what, say, feminist women are looking for in relationships. I think there's so much confusion, and the confusion is all on the hands of men. The whole chivalry thing, where do they open a door? Do they not open a door? Are they going to get abused for it? Should they pay for a meal? Should they not pay for a meal? And I completely understand where men are now saying, to hell with it, sort yourself out. I know that, the whole white knighting thing and stuff, it always makes me smile a little bit. In some ways, I quite like for a man to open a door for me, but I don't expect it. I don't have any sense of entitlement over it. But at the same time, I would also open a door for any man. If I'm there first, that's what I'll do. So, I don't know. I think we've got it all wrong. I think we need to get back to basics. Well, I think one of the things,
the two things that I think are germane to all these arguments. One is I see and work with a huge amount of women with personality disorders that are completely unable to make normal relationships with anybody, let alone men.
Yeah.
Now, one of the problems is that, and to be absolutely honest with you, and I know many of the women who were in the early days of the feminist movement, and we've been in battle for over 40 years. Many of them I would diagnose as seriously narcissistic exhibitionists and dangerous to any cause. Certainly they should never have been parents. So I get attacked all the time for saying this, but I promise you, the radical feminists that I know, in and out of governments, in non-governmental organizations, are women I would not like to meet down a dark alley on a dark night. They are dangerous. And those are the women you get most of this appalling attack, particularly on the family. It was avowed all those years ago that the new family image would be women and children, and men would be disinterred out of the family and would not have any say in their children's lives. And that actually has been remarkably successful when you think about it.
It certainly has, and the number of men that I'm speaking to, particularly here in Australia at the moment, that are alienated from their children, where children are essentially being abducted on that basis that the woman's rights will be protected, and therefore they're calling it the children's rights to be protected as well. Protected from what? I think that we're doing society a huge disservice, and it needs to change. Well, I fear for these children growing up without their fathers. I fear for, not only the role of having a man in the house, but what that means, what we're saying about men to these children, what we're saying about their fathers. It's hugely damaging.
Yes, it actually is. And we've got another 5 minutes before we have to wrap everything up. But I keep coming back to this. Betty Friedan, who wrote the original book, The Feminine Mystique, that kicked all this into touch in America, came to England in 1980 1 to the American Embassy, where she stood up in front of a huge audience, and I was there, and she recanted. And she said the mistake we women made is going for the male's economic jugular. We wanted power and money. She said, but what we should have done is to look at relationships between men and women, and we didn't.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, but she'd done the damage by then. You know, by then it was absolutely full frontal.
Well, what I still find fascinating, Erin, is that I can find no writing of her making that speech except
I'm
for
sure you can't. I'm absolutely sure.
They wouldn't want it out there. They wouldn't want it out there, would they?
No.
So listen, we do only have a couple of minutes left. Jasmin, your website is relatingtomen.com. Why don't you speak for a minute or two about exactly what you do through your website and through your services?
Right. Well, you know, we probably started out this conversation this way, and I never quite got through it. But initially, as you introduced me, I'm a sex and relationships coach, and you know, just speaking to that last point about, you know, working on relationships. And for me, relationships are not necessarily your intimate relationships. It's how we see ourselves and how we interact with the world around us. And you know, so relationships can be, you know, with a partner or in terms of, you know, just how we show up in the world. So in terms of my coaching, that's where I've specialised, and that's an area that I really enjoy. Most of my work at the moment is being driven more towards advocacy work for men and for men's rights. Part of the healing journey that I take men who have been traumatised or damaged through the system of what's happening to them in terms of you know, parental alienation, false accusations, all that sort of work, is about sharing their stories and being able to firstly have somebody hear their story, and then secondly put that story into words. And I often write the stories of men for them, and so I provide a number of services in that regard. It's certainly something that's under a huge amount of development at the moment, and I'm creating some content, you know, some easily accessible, quick, short ebook formats for men to be able to download, to be able to, you know, to self-help, get a little bit of the help themselves, so that they can start to articulate what it is that has happened to them, so they can start to speak freely again.
That sounds wonderful. How about that? You did mention your video. How do you get that?
It's on my site on relatingtomen.com, and it's the most recent blog. It's also on AVFM. Thank you, Dean. And on YouTube. So
it's very available then. I advise everybody to go and have a look.
Yes.
It's been great talking to you, you know, Jasmin. Really wonderful.
Thank you, Erin. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, though.
I warned you, didn't I, Jasmin? You know, every guest I have, they say, every guest I have, almost every guest anyway, says, really? We're going to talk a whole hour? What are we going to do? And the hour's over, and they're like, wait a minute, we've hardly started. But that's all right.
I'm used to radio interviews that are like, you know, I've got maybe 3 minutes of time or at most 10 minutes. So, yes, it went very fast.
Great.
All right. Well, everybody, please be sure to check out relatingtomen.com, where Jasmin Newman has a lot of interesting content for men. And she does relationship and sex and other coaching advice for men, exclusively for men. Yes, her video is on. I'll make sure her video is linked on our archive of the show. Any closing thoughts for this week, Erin?
No, I just think the closing thought that I have is for all people who feel as we do and are listening to this program, to spend as much time as possible as you can with younger people and your sons and daughters, so that they can discuss this issue with you, because it's our saviors are going to be the next generation, or this young generation now.
I quite agree.
I agree entirely. Yeah.
All right, everybody. Next week at this time, we will be back with Tales from the Infrared, which is our show on geek culture. And Erin and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next guest, as yet unnamed. We have a few candidates in mind, so stay tuned. All right, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you very much.
Good night.